Welcome everybody to today's webinar hosted by Decker and QSI. Again, thank you all for joining and spending time with us here today. The topic for today will be risk management and will be presented by Mr. Bud Whiteman, President of QSI. Before we dive into everything, just a few housekeeping items. Firstly, a copy of the slide deck along with the recording of the webinar will be shared with everybody shortly after the completion of today's session. Also, Mr. Whiteman will be taking questions throughout the presentation as they come up. So if you have a question, please go ahead and enter them into the chat, and then we'll queue them up for Bud to address and answer as time purposes. We'll do a follow-up and send out an additional Q&A sheet with any questions, with all questions and answers listed. So, as I mentioned, Bud Whiteman is the president of QSI and has been involved with management and technical systems for over 40 years. He is an international management system consultant, an author, and his experience really spans from initial development through implementation to certification and all the way through maintenance of business management systems. Bud's got cross-disciplinary experience working with not just 9001 or 14 or 18001, but with other industry-specific certification schemes like AS9100, APIQ1, and ASME, just to name a few. Currently, Bud serves on numerous committees for standards development and has assisted with many types of clients from small to medium and large, Fortune 500, and even Fortune Global 500 organizations with successful implementation. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Bud Whiteman to the stage. It's all yours, Bud.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now, Dennis, help me with the sharing of the screen here.
But I think you should be good to go.
Okay, so it says, okay.
You just hit the share and then reselect your PowerPoint.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay. I think that does it. Can everybody see it okay?
Yep, looks good.
Yep.
Okay, so today's discussion topics are going to be in relation to the following. So it's going to be risk with regards to documenting your quality management system with the context of the organization, with your strategic direction, with internal and external issues, interested parties, and organizational knowledge. And there'll be some additional things in there. So this is not the typical information that's identified in ISO 9001 in clause 6.1 that discusses the actions to address risk and opportunities. I pretty much concentrated on the quality assurance aspects as they relate to risk and to demonstrate how risk can really enter into your quality management system in multiple ways. And then we will also discuss risk evaluation and risk assessment. So just as a brief, QSI, we basically are involved in consulting, auditing, training, and management systems in the quality management system standards that were mentioned a little bit earlier. And we also develop end-to-end software that will allow an organization at multiple geographical locations to access the same information simultaneously. So basically it houses all your quality management system documents and work procedures, and the databases necessary to control the documents to demonstrate conformity to management systems. So today, I want to start with examining the wording of your document quality management system. So what I typically look at when I see a new version of a quality management system or a new management system that comes out is the terminology. And the terminology kind of gives you a clue to what focus the quality management system standard is taking. So if you want to start looking at risk, you have the word shall. So the number of times I'm showing here in this chart are approximate. I'm sure that if somebody else counts it, it may be more or less, but that's kind of academic for the purpose of this discussion. So if you develop your management system documents and you use the word shall, make sure that you have some boundaries on what that shall means for your organization. That in itself will help mitigate risk in the quality management system. So when you take a look at the word risk itself, it's identified approximately 16 times, and so that pretty much identifies risk associated with the planning of risk and in operations. Then you get into the words as appropriate and suitable. As appropriate is 18 times more or less. Suitable is 9 times more or less. So the question is, why do they matter? So basically, in some of the information that goes with ISO 9001 and SL and some of the other information that was published as a result of ISO 9001 2015 development, the discussion around as appropriate is in the standard. It's in ISO 9001. But if you transfer the direct wording out of ISO 9001 into your quality management system as appropriate, what does that mean? So if you have multiple departments, if you have a large company, you have multiple departments, and you say that documented information will be maintained as appropriate, what is appropriate? So if you don't identify the boundaries of what appropriate means for your organization, then you're opening yourself up to risk. That's what the point is. So suitable falls in the same category, and if you look up synonyms for appropriate or synonyms for suitable, you're basically talking the same thing. What does it mean for your organization? So when the standard's talking about as appropriate or as suitable, it's basically asking you to make a decision on drawing boundaries of what that means. So we control documents by one or more of the following ways. And if you list 5 ways you control documents, then you've identified what suitable is or what appropriate is. And you've still met the shall, if that makes any sense. Okay? And then other considerations that you have is where are the words being used? So if you're using the words, if you still have retained a quality management system manual and you use the manual at a very high level, that wording may flow down to your procedures and or your work instructions, and that wording may expand and or multiply. So be very careful on how you use the words and where you flow the words down to and what level of documentation. So anytime...
Sorry to interrupt you there. Some people are saying they're having a hard time hearing, so I just want to clarify, is everyone listening able to hear me? If you could indicate in the chat box, I'd greatly appreciate it. And are all of you able to hear Bud as well? Okay, great. I think we might have had a momentary audio issue for some people, but thanks for that, Bud, and you can keep going.
Okay, thank you. So the considerations are, where are the words used, how many times they're used, right? So it's very important to keep track of that. So if 9001 identifies a shall, when you flow it down to your work level instructions or even on your forms, that shall needs to remain a shall. If it doesn't, then you're breaking away from the standard and or the intent of the standard. And by doing so, there's a possibility of introducing risk to your system. And then will the implementation of the specific wording reduce your risk? And in my view, yes, it will reduce your risk, particularly if you draw the boundaries around that. And a lot of times in drawing the boundaries around it, when it comes, let's just talk about documented information. So you may be talking about documented information throughout your organization, So you typically see document controls for a quality management system in purchasing, in engineering, in production, and most of the typical production-related departments. However, sometimes that may not transfer to a service that you might be offering that may be in another division of your company, and that other division may be on site and may be as part of the ISO 9001 certification. So it's important to say, and we'll get to the context of the organization in a minute, but it's important to say exactly how the requirements flow back up to your top tier documentation. So let's assume you have a quality manual, and if you do, you want to make sure that information flows all the way back up to that quality manual. And then the other thing is making sure that you understand how the words are used in the introduction and scope of Annex A and ISO 9001, because they identify can, may, should. So is it acceptable to use can, may, and should? It is. However, you have to look at whether or not those words can pose a risk if there's any action items that relate to that. As an example, in the oil and gas industry, regulatory requirements published in the Code of Federal Regulations will identify industry recommended practices. And those recommended practices will have the word may or should in them. However, when those words are used in a regulatory requirement, or that recommended practice is used in a regulatory requirement, it becomes mandatory. So you can see how there's somewhat of a dichotomy that's set up as to what level of conformity or compliance that you have to have. Now, when I'm saying conformity, I'm basically using that word conformity associated with ISO 9001, and I'm using compliance to say that would be appropriate with regards to legal requirements and or statutory or regulatory requirements. So the wording is very important in your management system. So shall indicates a requirement. It'd be good to ensure that all the shells are flowed down from higher to lower level documents. When I use the word flow down, I mean if they're in the manual and the manual requires the use of certain documented information, as in procedures, then those shells need to flow down from 9001 into those procedures and into lower tier documents such as work instructions or standardized operating procedures. And then verification of the word shells need to be evaluated through the internal audit process. Are we meeting shell in all areas of our quality management system to which that system applies? Okay, so when you take a look at risk, a risk overall is addressed about 32 times. So when I say 32 times, I'm talking about the word risk itself, I'm talking about appropriate, I'm talking about suitable, okay? So where and how those words are used sheds light on the focus of the standard and hence your quality management system. So 9001 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities, will provide your overall framework of addressing risk wherever it occurs in the quality management system. So you can evaluate and assess the risk depending upon how critical those words and any following actions are to your processes and to your company. So when you're looking at your quality management system and processes, here are a few examples of how risk can sneak into your system. So if you're looking at example contract review activities or customer requirements and how the customer requirements are translated into your system. So it's going to be dependent upon what your product or your offering is, and if you're dealing with products, you may have different material grades. If a customer requests a new grade, that may introduce a risk. Customer requirements may introduce industry codes or standards. Anytime codes or standards are introduced, there's an inherent risk there as to keeping up with the latest edition of the codes and standards unless you're committed to a very specific year and or addenda. Statutory and regulatory requirements always have a potential for risk by making sure that you know the statutory and regulatory requirements and the level of compliance that you have to provide to demonstrate your actions. So based upon the level of risk associated with contract review, you may need to develop additional production processes. You may need to utilize new suppliers. There's probably another 20 things we could discuss related to the contract review process. Also, with regards to like design and development, again, depending upon your products, if you have to create a new design, that may introduce a risk if that new design changes form, fit, or function from the original design, or if it's a larger diameter product, or if it's being used in a manner in which it wasn't used before. So when you're looking at design, you could brainstorm, some of the aspects of your product and how your products are currently being used versus any future requests to make changes. And all these things that I'm talking about, like so far in contract review, design, and the upcoming items I'll be discussing, when I'm saying it could present a risk, I'm meaning that you need to do a risk assessment or consider the need for a risk assessment, whether or not it's necessary, and document your justification. Then any customer involvement in the design process may represent its own risk, depending upon whether or not any changes come in based upon actual meetings versus contractual documents. And then the integration of the design output and input into your physical design, which would include industry code standards and statutory and regulatory requirements. Another way the risk can enter your system is through the operations. So are you manufacturing a specific product type day in and day out, or do you vary in the different types of products that you manufacture, and do those products have different quality levels? If they do, then you may want to develop quality plans to mitigate your risk. Another question is, it depends on what industry you're in. You may have to create new machining fixtures that may need to be approved by your customers. If you have a fixture department or a maintenance department that makes your fixtures, you may want to have a quality hold point on that fixture to make sure it's the appropriate fixture for the appropriate job. Additional things include qualification of welders and other personnel with regards to processes requiring validation. In some industries, welding is a process requiring validation, heat treatment, non-destructive examination, and others. So that adds additional areas for risk if the personnel are not qualified and or certified appropriately. And then if you have to expand the capacity of your manufacturing operation, then is that going to be meaning putting on additional shifts? Are there additional risks? Or is that going to mean expanding the capacity beyond your own boundaries to a supplier? Again, the more potential for risk. So in looking at the words of the standard, I associate other wording with risk. So when I see the words opportunities, that's where preventive action used to be. Appropriate, suitable, risk, potential, consequences, impact, change. So you can see where this is going. So if you look at risk and you categorize all these other words under risk, that's another prism view of how you might want to look at risk and what it means to your processes and or your products. So other examples of appropriate, these are 3 examples. I don't need to go through each one, but when you're talking about control of documented information, and the standard says documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the quality management system shall be identified as appropriate and controlled. Well, again, what are the boundaries of appropriate? So does your engineering design identify external codes and standards from which they use? There's certain ASTM standards. There may be the ASME boiler and pressure vessel code that apply. There may be something called Rourke's formulas for design. Again, define the boundaries. When you're looking at your inspection and test documented information as part of the design output, there's generally external standards that come to play if you're dealing with non-destructive examination. So the documents of external origin can creep into your system in very many ways, even from your customers, from regulators, and so on. So I urge you to keep an eye on the documented information and ensure that you have controls in place for that. If not, you may miss out on the need to have technical conformity within your system. So when you're talking about another new criteria of 9001, the context of the organization is important. So context of the organization is, I would say it's very parallel to the scope of the organization as used in the past, but context has a little bit more breadth. In a lot of the areas that I practice in is when you say scope or context of the organization, they're basically meaning the manufacturing or service site. So it's a building, a location, and it really doesn't extend beyond there. So if you look at some of the examples given here, you know, are we talking about a single location or multiple locations? If you're talking about a production site, do you have a repair shop next door that's not in your ISO 9001 stream of production? Do you have multiple production lines, and do you have ISO 9001 only for a single production line? Does it deal with warranty issues? Does it deal with installation, maintenance, repair, service? Some of these words could be synonymous. Depending on the industry, some of those words could be different. So what I would urge you to do is look at the context of the organization a little bit beyond what the normal scope is. So the context of your organization can be something that changes with the organization's strategic direction and or new marketing or sales areas or geographical areas that you might want to sell into, as an example. So the context of your organization may be changing depending upon what other groups within your organizations do, whatever their output is. Okay, so if we talked about the organization's strategic direction, so what's the high-level strategy of the organization? What's the risk of the high-level strategy? So if you're breaking into another marketplace and you're starting a new product in a new geographical area, it's important for a couple things. Will that particular product sell in that area? Will it be accepted as you're advertising it in that geographical area? So these two may represent risks that, you know, not just for the quality department to perform, but for the business to perform as a risk assessment for the business that may include cross-functional teams from quality, sales, marketing, design, procurement, and so forth, right? What about supply chain strategies and the level of risk associated with the supply chain? Do you have any sole suppliers? Is there a risk with that? Depending upon the supplier, is there geographical location a risk, meaning that in the wintertime or in flood season, it may represent a risk for the delivery of the product to you. Depending upon the country, the risk may be associated with, you know, routine strikes in a geographical area. So again, all this may be dependent upon particular factors that are associated with your product and your business in general. So outreach we talked about, like domestically or globally, and even competitor intelligence, right? What are your competitors doing in those areas? Or are they successful? So you might be able to handle risk through competitor intelligence. So think about what potential risks could surface if you change your strategic direction. So that might be a good time to sit down with the cross-functional teams. So we're talking about internal or external issues. So what does internal or external issue mean? So that means different things to different people, but here's a few of them. So if you have legal, statutory, or regulatory changes, maybe a change in strategy, maybe market penetration, the international codes or standards, technology. So as an example for international codes and standards, is ISO 9001:2015 an external issue? I would say it is. I would count it as one. Why would I say that? Because I would track anytime any external codes or standards that change, that we subscribe to, change, what impact does that have upon my organization? What is the level of risk and how do we mitigate that risk? If the standard changes, are we willing to do a gap analysis and integrate those changes into our system? Technology-wise, technology changes every day. Robotics is coming into play in more and more organizations. So, perhaps you need some risk assessments with the types of products that you're manufacturing and the impact upon the new technology. Then, interested parties. Who are your interested parties, right? Here's a listing of interested parties. So it could be the owners or stakeholders in the business, employees, the customers, suppliers, unions, regulators, the community. So we have customers that are in manufacturing of cement. So the cement plants are located on a limestone mine that have 100 years of supply. So they have a community outreach program because as they're mining the limestone, they're also blasting. So there's a whole host of complaints that come in about the blasting. So they've created outreach groups, and they've actually created some seismic monitoring around the borders of the mine to actually identify the level of potential impact in the community. So what potential risk could occur if there's some changes to the existing interested parties or if you add some new interested parties to the mix? So the interested parties could be, many more things, but again, these are just some examples to get thinking about the new changes to 9001 and how risk may surface in your organization. Okay? Then,
hey, Bud, really quick, a couple of questions have come up, so I just want to make sure we have a chance to address them and hear them out. So one of the questions that came up was, how does an organization show evidence of strategic direction?
Yeah, so what we've done with customers is we've written let's say, a guidance document for our quality management system on what is strategic direction and who has responsibility for. And basically, we call it a management team approach, and executive management will be involved. Marketing is generally involved. Production, engineering, depending upon what the strategy is going to include, if it includes market share versus new product release and such. So it could be a very high-level 2 or 3 page guidance document. And we basically said, identify that when strategy sessions are held, they may, and we use this word on purpose, they may, not shall, they may include a SWOT analysis. So to take a look at our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats related to that strategy. One thing I'm always hesitant about is if an auditor says, I need to see your strategy. And the first thing that goes through my mind is, yeah, sure. What I'm going to show them is the work instruction, and I'm going to show them some SWOT analysis. If you consider your strategy important to your organization and competitive information, it's up to you whether or not you share it to any other external party. So that's definitely a consideration. So I would make it a guidance document, put a SWOT analysis template in there, talk to your management, and say, maybe you have review meetings on a regular basis for quality objectives. And I would, and during those review meetings, I would say, are we changing any strategy? And I would document a SWOT analysis for that. And just write that into whenever you're having quality-related meetings on quality objectives and or management reviews. Okay? So with regards to organizational knowledge, organizational knowledge is what you have now. So if you take a look at where the term knowledge bank came up, that basically came up with Howard Hughes way back in the day. And he considered, his processes, his people, everything he had to be assets and part of the knowledge bank. So are human resources part of the organizational knowledge? You bet. The biggest concern comes when you have an aging workforce and people are going to go into retirement. So there in itself is a risk. How do you manage mentorship or some other means of extracting an individual's experience when they had 30 years of experience with your business or more, right? So that may be documented information, documenting work instructions and procedures, working with these individuals to, glean additional things that they know that haven't been passed down to the younger generation or to the corporation yet. That's huge in industry. So all these things are your organizational knowledge. Your designs, your patents, your trademarks, your industry papers, your copyrights, any industry license or certifications, any programs you develop, your websites, all this is organizational knowledge. So, you know, the types of procedures I've written on this in the past is saying, this is what we have as organizational knowledge. If we need to develop further organizational knowledge, these are the steps. And then you get into who identifies it, where do you obtain the organizational knowledge, how do you document it, how do you keep it. So an example of obtaining additional organizational knowledge would be, okay, so there's changes to ISO 9001 2015 come out. This webinar is changing organizational knowledge. We just got a new numerically controlled machine in. However, we want to get a new machine, but we don't know how. We have the budget to do it, but we don't know how to use it. Well, what do? You have the manufacturer's rep come in, or one of their technicians to teach your people how to do it. And that goes along with any new technology that you might want to acquire. And there's also legal methods of doing that from the standpoint of licensing somebody else's technology or products. And there are plenty of intellectual property attorneys that can do that. So I really like this particular part in being incorporated in 9001 because this allows an organization to, you know, identify what they have, and this really works good with strategic direction on moving towards what they need. Okay, so risk. Okay, so the things I just talked about are some examples of where risk may come up in your company, right? So, or through the quality management system. What I just talked about so far in this presentation were just examples. There's hundreds of examples. One of the things you might want to do to get a better read on the risk you have is go back and take a look at past corrective action reports, take a look at warranty work, take a look at any field failures, take a look at any customer complaints, and, you know, again, what are some of the things that have happened to competitors' businesses that you don't want to happen to your business? All these are forms of defining what risk is. When you identify the risk, you may want to keep a list of potential risks and issue a priority code to them, right? Like high, medium, low priorities. And if they don't serve, or let's say if they don't present an immediate risk to your business or to health and safety, you know, you can go back and look at them when you feel it's timely. Anything that's marked as a priority or a high-level risk, you probably want to look at sooner than later. But methods of evaluating risk are, there's a lot of different ones. Here's some examples. So you could use fishbone diagrams, and you could fill out a fishbone diagram to determine what kind of risk you have. You could use cause and effect diagrams, fault tree analysis, the failure modes effect analysis, brainstorming. A fishbone is a form of brainstorming. You could do brainstorming with sticky notes. You could use mind maps. I like mind mapping software. To me, that really allows me to think a little bit freer and get the information down in a diagram that I understand. Flow charting. Flow charting is a little bit more detailed. A SWOT diagram. So the question is, do I have to use all these tools all the time? And the answer is not really. It depends upon what level of evaluation you need to perform and how deep you need to go. So you can liken this with root cause analysis, right? Some of the same tools are used for root cause analysis, and again, it's just depending upon how deep you need to dig down with regards to that risk and how high of that risk is and what is the likelihood of that risk recurring again. So this is just a short form for recording risk, and you can see a risk number, a date. Identified by means who is the individual or department that identified it. Location means where within the organization was it found. Then you identify the risk. Then I have in here detection method used, right? And the reason I have detection method used is I want to know where that risk is found and how it was found, right? So if one of my detection methods is receiving inspection, and I find a lot of risks there, I may want to start doing some training of my risk register to figure out why I'm having so many risks pop up during receiving inspection. Another method is documentation of nonconformances, documentation of corrective actions, warranties, right? Customer complaints, particularly field failures. So all these things can be used to track risk. I would recommend that if different departments track their own risk, that you have one central location for gathering all of these things in one database, so you can analyze it under analysis of data and report back on it during the management or review. And then I also want to talk about like who the risk owner is, and if you can get down to the risk cause, it'd be like a root cause, that would be great. And then this can also be extended into, depending upon how detailed that risk was and how many points, let's say how many action items you have to take to correct it, you might want to have an action item log to correct each part of that risk you identified. And as you correct it, it's okay to use corrective actions. It's okay to use any other tools to mitigate that risk. And in mitigation, we mean to reduce that risk or to totally remove that risk. And then we do that, let's say we could mitigate it, meaning lessen it, but there's still going to be some risk. Then how do we monitor that to make sure it doesn't get out of hand and hurt us, right? And mitigation may be okay in some cases. If you look at the ISO 31000 guidelines, they talk about risk sharing. And a lot of times you do risk sharing and you may not even know this. So risk sharing is having a supplier build something for you, and because they have the know-how, that's a form of risk sharing. So there may be different forms of risk sharing and different decisions that go on with risk mitigation.
Well, a couple of other questions that have come up here.
Okay.
So firstly, one here talks about the appendix in AS 9100 mentions that a formal process is only required for operational risk management. How do we demonstrate evidence of risk-based thinking apart from our operational risk management process?
Well, I think part of that's going to determine what's in the operational risk management process. I don't know what that includes. I mean, I'm just hearing as far as words. I haven't seen it or know what it includes, but I'm assumptions. To give an example, so in AS 9100, I believe there's requirements for control of fixtures and jigs. I believe there's part number controls and revision controls. I believe there's a level of customer approval. There's also some controls that are necessary to reduce any type of contamination. I know that with certain types of metal that one of our customers machines, the machining of that type of metal itself can present a health and environmental hazard, because it's basically breathing in the fumes of the smoke from that metal is harmful, right? So that's a risk mitigation point. Something else may be if it's the production or operational process. If your operational process includes buyouts of components, smaller components from another company, there are requirements in AS 9100 that relate to counterfeit product controls, right? So that may be another method how you relate to risk and operational planning. So part of that I would, and again, you may have a really great operational plan document that I'm not seeing, but you might want to go back over whether or not it's flow charted, whether if you brainstorm each of the operations if there's any risks. What are, again, go back to what ISO 9001 teaches, input, output for each of those processes, and along with input and output, where do the inputs come from? Which departments? Is it one department? Is it any external parties? Is it a vendor that's embedded within your operation? Look at the competencies of all those individuals that are related to that, how it goes into those inputs, and the same thing when it goes to the outputs. So those are about 3 or 4 examples of how I would look at that.
Perfect.
And was there another similar question?
Yeah, we've got a couple. Yes, a couple others. This one relates to what we were just talking about in terms of organizational knowledge. So it talks about in relation to organizational knowledge, is the employee performance periodic evaluation supported in this clause?
I think only if you want to bring it into it, right? So, and the reason I say that is because it's I don't have an electronic copy of 9001 in front of me right now, but it does get into human error in the operational section, right, of 9001-2015. So when I hear human error, it really scares me because there's another side of me saying that's the practice of mistake proofing. There's companies that spend millions of dollars in mistake proofing, particularly in the field of design and unintended use of a product. So if I would say the personnel evaluation is set up in a positive manner, right? In other words, you would have an addendum to the personnel evaluation, and that addendum may be a checklist, and that checklist may be linked to the individual's job knowledge on their use of their SOPs, of any inspection, measuring, and test equipment, tools, fixtures, things like this. I would slant it to make sure that it could support risk management and the development of the employee, and so it's not used in a negative fashion, if that makes sense. So if you want it to be supported, under organizational knowledge, I would say you can, but make a checklist and let that checklist work towards something positive in helping reduce organizational risk.
Okay, a couple more that are related with lessons learned and interested parties here. Let's see. Is it okay to assume a lessons learned database would be considered part of the risk evaluation method? Is a lesson learned database a requirement?
No, it's not a requirement, but it's a fantastic idea. So I know, like on projects we do, if I do multiple invitations for a single organization location, we do a lessons learned document as part of the implementation, and then we review that with the other sites that we're going to be implementing. So lessons learned can be two different things. It may be used for risk. I mean, if it's a lesson, that means it's already happened. If it's already happened, it means you probably did a risk assessment or you made some sort of a correction. So I would utilize that, not as a requirement, but as a means to demonstrate that we've had risk, we've taken care of them, maybe not in a traditional sense of risk management, but now we have things that we can correct in our management system and demonstrate that we're mitigating risks from past mistakes. That's a good idea, though. That's the neat part of 9001-2015. It's in the eyes of the beholder, so there's no interpretation that that's absolutely required, but that's a fantastic tool.
Okay, and in terms of interested parties, is there a limit to the number of interested parties an organization can have, i.e. Unions, partners, things like that?
No, not at all. What I've done with interested parties is I basically say, here's our interested parties spreadsheet, right, matrix. Here's our interested parties. Here's what they might be interested in. There may be a relationship, and in that log, I would have a space to say, to show a space to say, here's the interaction we have with that interested party, here's the date, here's any follow-up action that's required, right? And I would write my procedure in such that anytime we have interaction with an interested party, we log the event. So logging the event isn't just enough. So the way 9001-2015 reads is if an interested party wants to have your quality policy it suggests that you give them your quality policy. What level of information are you willing to share with the interested party? Well, if it's a regulator, that's one thing. If it's the next door neighbor, it's another thing. So the other fallout of interested parties, and if you're logging things in, is are there any actions to be followed up? And how do you document those follow-up actions, if that makes sense? So you'd want to demonstrate that you have followed them up and you have closed them out. So it'd be a log with multiple columns to show that you have interaction with interested parties. As an example, I have a customer that's in Indonesia, and they have a manufacturing facility, and it runs 24 hours a day. And there's a village close by, and the manufacturing facility is making noise, so the neighbors were throwing rocks on the tin roof of the manufacturing facility and complaining. So the owner requested a meeting with the community members, and he basically offered anybody that wanted to have a job at nighttime to come over and apply, and he effectively removed the problem by giving a job. So that was kind of a unique way to handle interested parties and complaints. He gave the people a job, and particularly on the shift where we were making the most noise. So that kind of helped things out. Okay. Were there any other questions?
Yes, and there was one more about, not necessarily a question, but asking about competency. It says that during the discussion on organizational knowledge, competency was not brought up. Is there anything that you can add to this topic?
Sure, yeah. So organizational knowledge is huge. So typically in implementation of most quality systems, it's when a person's being hired, I equate the hiring of a person to their qualification. So you have a person, you have their CV or resume, and you're comparing that against your job description, saying the person has to have this level of training, they may have to have a certain level of qualification, they may have to have certain level of skills, right, such as job knowledge, blueprint reading, know how to use dimensional measurement equipment, things of this nature. So that's part of it. The other part of competency is that the individuals are aware of their objectives and that they're aware of how a nonconformance related to what they do may impact the customer. So those are some additional things that you could share with organizational knowledge, right? So a lot of companies have skills matrices, right? So it would be specific skills matrices and saying this is where the person can start. They may have on-the-job training. They may have mentorship, but we're going to get them up to this level. Another thing that can make changes to that would be obviously changes in health and safety requirements where you may have to go back in and upgrade the competencies. And particularly like in the oil and gas industry, there's customer supplied or customer identified training. So what that means, if somebody's going to be going onto an active rig that's being drilled onshore or offshore, they have to have the requisite training prior to going off. So if they're going to be going offshore, they have to have helicopter survival training. They have to have rig pass, or there's some other names for it, training, safety training, ropes training, meaning you can swing from a rope from a boat to the platform, and some other things. So there's a whole level of additional training and an actual license or an identification from the Department of Transportation. So again, it depends on what your industry is and how broad you want to take that information of competencies as organizational knowledge. So for example, in the slide, I did have job descriptions. So that's kind of like a high-level discussion of what competencies are. But yeah, skills matrices would be a perfect thing to support those job descriptions.
All right, there's a few more, but we can go ahead and we can hang on to rest of them. I'll let you finish this part of the presentation, and towards the end we'll have a few more questions, and then if we run out of time, then we'll go ahead and do a follow-up with the questions asked.
Oh, sure. Okay, so this is the last slide, and we're basically focused on the bottom of the slide that says related questions. So once you do your risk assessment, did you actually create a new risk as part of the risk assessment? That's a possibility. So if it's complex risk, you have a lot of action items to close out that risk, you may stumble across a brand new risk in that process. And then if you do, you would have to address that as a new risk under a different risk number, under a different risk assessment. The next thing is there any residual risk from identifying the mitigations for any given risk? So residual risk is that we haven't been able to totally remove the risk. There's always going to be a risk with that. So what is your mitigation plan, and how do you monitor to make sure that that risk doesn't get out of control? If there's residual risk and it affects a customer, you want to make sure that a customer understands that, but you would have to discuss it internally and determine how that would be communicated to the customer if it's related to a product or a service. And then as you're going through the process, is there a need to develop a contingency plan to support the mitigation process? And the contingency plan would identify what contingencies would fall into place. Do you need any emergency equipment? Do you need any emergency production capabilities? Who would be involved? How fast can those extra resources be turned on? What's the time frame? And are the contact personnel and their telephone numbers in there to implement a contingency plan? And then the very top question is there a need for a management of change based upon the risk process that you went through? And that may mean, based upon what you went through, you may have to change your product design as an example. And it may have to require new features, something like this. So it's just not identification of risk and just saying, okay, we looked at it, it's good. Depending on how far you want to take it, the process goes really deep. It goes as deep as you want to, but if you want to reduce overall systemic risk, that's what you want to do. It would, and as 9001 in 6.1 talks about, it would prevent or reduce the undesirable effects. It would enhance the desirable effects, and you would achieve improvement from the process. So that's pretty much the last slide. If you want to ask some more questions, I'm open.
All right. Let's see here. So one question we have here is, what is the difference between the old standard preventative action and risk management?
Yeah, so the new standard risk management, preventive action comes in as an opportunity. So if you remember on one of the slides, I had key words associated with risk, and one of them was opportunity. And that was the preventive action part. So in my way of thinking, if it's an opportunity and it's a preventive action means it hasn't happened yet, is that really a risk? And in my way of thinking, I would think that'd be a low-level risk. You already know you need to make an improvement for some reason. It would equate to like walkways that are marked in yellow in a manufacturing facility and a pellet hanging out of a production cell onto the walkway. Well, the preventive action is move the pellet. Do I need to write a risk assessment up for that? I would say no. But I do want to make one point with that question. ISO 9001 does not talk about health and safety. So when you're manufacturing product or service, you have a service company, there are Code of Federal Regulations that require personal protective equipment and certain controls. If you're dealing with manufacturing, you're primarily dealing with OSHA. If you're dealing with a surface mine or mining, you're dealing with MSHA, which is OSHA's counterpart for mining. So what I would encourage is do not be linear in this process of risk for quality management systems. There are many organizations that have their quality management system procedures or their work instructions, a stop sign, some sort of colored indicator, some sort of warning that says, put on your PPE for this particular process. Wear your face shield. Put your rubber gloves on because you're dealing with caustic materials. So again, I would look at this as, yes, it's great for quality management system stuff. It's great for HSE, but when you combine them, it becomes a more powerful tool for your company.
Perfect. We'll take
I want to add a
couple more
quick
here.
note there. We are running a little bit over the 3 o'clock time that we had mentioned as our close, but we are going to stick around and answer a few questions. But if you do need to hop off, we will be sending out the recording of this as well as the answers to any questions that we don't get to.
Thank you, Marcus. Yes, we'll take a couple more, and then, like you said, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. So that being said, we'll take one more here. Let's see. Do we need a documented process for risk management?
I would recommend you do. And the reason I say that, okay, it's like, do you need a documented process for management review? And the answer is not required, right? But I document for our customers an actual checklist for them to go through that addresses more than the ISO 9001 requirements. It probably addresses 3 times as much. And the reason for it is to reduce risk in the company. The other thing you want to do, depending upon how big your organization is, how many people are involved in risk, you may not do risk assessments on a regular basis. So what you would want to do is retain that knowledge and make sure that when they are done, that everybody does the risk process at the same time. And the other thing I'd recommend is that when you do risk assessments, you do it with a cross-functional team. You do risk assessment, and again, this is in my view of thinking, risk assessment, contingency planning, and management change with a cross-functional team, because there's liability involved with these processes, and there's cost involved with these processes. So you want to make sure that you have the management team that's there that can make the decision, this is what we're going to do, or, stop doing something. And so a documented procedure, it doesn't have to be a procedure. It could be a checklist. It could be a series of forms. It could be a series of bullet-pointed things that you follow. It could be a slide presentation. It's whatever works for your company. But I would have something just to make sure that you have it available so you could repeat the process time in and time out.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much, Bud. And with that, like Marcus said, we're running a little bit over, so we're going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar at this point here. Again, we appreciate everyone who took their time to join today, and especially appreciate Bud and your time and your expertise that you shared with us today. Again, we'll be sending out the recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slides to everybody, so you guys can expect that in your inbox shortly. And again, for any of the questions that were unanswered, we'll also do a follow-up to send out a list of questions and their associated answers as well. So again, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.